think this one. If I share my screen now, can everyone see that? Can everyone see the PDF? Yes, awesome, great. Great. Where is that screen gone? One of these days I'll definitely get around this software. Okay, so we're at the 8:59 mark. So I guess we can just start now. And I guess people can join as they come on. All right. First off, welcome. So thank you so much, guys, for taking time out of your weekends to join. I really appreciate it. I know everyone's kind of like, you guys have busy lives, and yeah, so I hope that you'll get something useful out of the session today. And yeah, so to kind of start this presentation, I just wanted to kind of continue what I mentioned in a previous email. I guess one of the reasons I'm doing this is that over the past, I think, 2-3 months-ish, I've been getting more and more emails just from readers or people who are just passing by Canto Lounge. And a common question was like, was that, why don't you have more content, right? Just in Cantonese. Maybe you want to talk in Cantonese about a particular subject, or you just want to, I don't know, just talk in Cantonese, right? Instead of presenting Cantonese in English, which is the case now. And the answer for me is, it's quite simple. The fact of the matter is that just based on everything I have seen and learned about Cantonese learners, and that's not obviously not for everyone, right? And from my teaching experiences before, when I was teaching Cantonese, it's just like in the beginning, at the very least, most people aren't interested in seeing that much Cantonese, right? So I kind of have to start with doing Cantonese from an English perspective and then move on. And so in doing that, I'd love to put out more content to start putting out content in Cantonese only. But before I do so, I kind of want to backtrack to this presentation, I guess, where it all starts, where we're all learning Cantonese, and talk about some difficulties and perhaps mistakes that people tend to make when learning it. So with that in mind, let's get started. So just a quick disclaimer, I guess. This is I'm kind of going to air a product today. I haven't done a product in such a long time. If you've been around Cantonese for a while, the previous one, I think, was Canto Drills. And I think about a year ago, we did authentic Cantonese transcripts. But yeah, so I think it's time to do something new. And this is kind of the preview to it. But I don't want this to be kind of like a promotion, and whether you're interested in what I have to offer or whatnot or not, I still hope that this presentation is going to help be helpful to you guys. So yeah, just stick around. I just wanted to get that out of the way before starting. But yeah, hopefully it's going to be useful to everyone. Okay, so are you guys ready? All right, let's dive right into it. And I'm going to split this session up into 2 sessions. 1 hour is a long time to actually sit down and listen to someone drone on and on about something. And so I'm going to pause at the 25-minute mark, and so we can have like a 5-minute break and then come back. And second of all, I would ask you guys, if you have any questions in between, feel free to type them in the message box. But know that I'm going to probably leave answering all the questions that you guys have, to the best of my ability, to the end of the presentation, because I want to focus on excuse me. Sorry, so I just wanted to focus on getting the presentation done, and then we'll have a dedicated like Q&A session afterwards. Okay, so that is that. Moving on. Just wanted to, let's see. How do I check? Okay, that's good. Sorry. Again, not a frequent user of Zoom. Okay, so let's dive right in. So 7 things that I have noticed that people, like mistakes or challenges people have when learning Cantonese. Some of these are generic, I guess, they're common to all languages, but some of them are, I guess, a little bit more Cantonese centric. First of all, is kind of not having a curriculum after graduating the beginner's level. So what exactly do I mean by that? Actually, very literally. So if you guys have been learning Cantonese for a while, I think that resources like this, Teach Yourself Cantonese, or the grammar text from Professor Stephen Matthews and Virginia Yip, and their excellent basic Cantonese grammar workbook, as well as the excellent intermediate reader series from Greenwood, I think, Press. There's Wedding Bells and a couple other titles I can't recall off the top of my head. So these are all resources that are catered mostly to the beginners level, and it's not that difficult to get your feet wet and kind of understand how Cantonese works from a syntactic, a grammatic, and acquiring basic vocabulary standpoint. But after you've gone past that point, here's the challenge. What's next? And so after you've kind of, once you have acquired the fundamentals, it's not always immediately clear what you should do next. And I feel that people tend to either lose clarity or get discouraged, or both, after going through these initial materials. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second mistake, if you want to call that, is lacking in depth or volume when learning Cantonese. So what do I mean by that? In Chinese, if you're aware of this, quality and quantity. So the word for quality is 質量, and we break it up, you get 質, which is this character here, and then 量, which is this character here. 質 means quality, and 量 means quantity, and together you get 質量, which together is just translated as quality. And so a lot of people, for example, they might go very deep. They might be working with, I don't know, reading an article or looking at a clip, and they might learn and drill really deep and try to understand all the vocabulary that's involved in that particular article or video or whatever it is that they're working with, and that might take quite a while, because if you have to drill in deep, right, that takes time. Or they might go the other route, and they might decide to do just a lot of Cantonese in a short period of time, in a short burst, right? But usually I feel that if we look, if you choose depth, it's easy to gloss over volume, and vice versa. So, or it could be easy to like both, and because you're making that transition from the beginner's level to the intermediate level. So that's something I feel that's problematic in the beginning. And so another way of interpreting that is, in the beginning, when you're working with materials like, I don't know, Teach Yourself Cantonese, or some kind of a conversational dialogue course, or maybe even Glossica, right? The topics that are typically covered are these, right? Food, home, transport, shopping, that's usually one. Studying, I guess, school-related terms that could come up in a classroom environment. Language, learning language to talk about language. talking about work. So these are all the common topics that come up. And so we kind of drill in, we can deep, you could have depth or you could have volume. But in terms of our understanding of Cantonese, these topics covered, to me, the question that I want to ask is this really enough for us in the long run if we want to keep Cantonese as a language that we're learning in the long run? Yeah, and especially for your situation, because what's applicable for one person might not necessarily be applicable for another person, right? So that's something to consider. The third mistake I see learners make is this is one of the more common ones, is sticking too long to beginners materials. So typically back in the day when I was working with students learning Cantonese, I would get students across the spectrum in terms of ability. So there'd be beginner students who are just starting out, who don't really know a lot about the structure of Cantonese, who are just learning pronunciation, or there are intermediate students who are fairly familiar with all that, but they might not have too much confidence in carrying on conversation. Or you get the advanced kind of group of students who just have already a large vocabulary. You know, they feel very comfortable diving into materials like pretty much for native speakers, but perhaps they lack, once again, that fluency, which is understandable because they've not studied in language before, right? But the one thing that was alarming for me was how pretty much I've never really been with a student long enough where I would tell that they moved from one level to another. So in other words, it's for beginner students, especially when I was working with them, it was very difficult, I feel, for them to accept moving forward to the intermediate level and learning in a different way. Because in the beginning, at the beginner's level, everything is kind of like laid out very well, right? You know, you go through a lesson, and then there's some text, there's a conversation, and then there's vocabulary, there's some new grammar structures and all that. But at an intermediate level, that's not how you learn, is it? You already have most of the basic structures down, and it's really time to let go of those scaffolds and dive a little bit more deeply into materials that are a little bit longer or that are a little bit more complex. Excuse me. So that's something I feel that is a common mistake that beginners tend to make. And this is something I think I drew a long time ago and I shared in a different presentation. And this is just based on my kind of learning experiences. Typically, when learning a language, we don't need to spend that much time in the basic quadrant. I feel that's like you can get past the basic stage in maybe 6 months to a year, depending on how different the language is from you, the time you have to devote to learning the language, resources, etc. But then that's after getting past that basic stage, that's when the real language learning happens. That's when you start being able to understand more, being able to express yourself more and more deeply, right? And so you'll typically find that you'll spend a lot of time in the intermediate level. And after a certain point in time, you'll move on to the advanced level. And after a certain point in time, you just kind of like stop, not because you can't continue learning, because it doesn't make any sense to continue expanding your vocabulary and whatnot. You already have a functional level of language. Just like, you know, after graduating college, you're probably not thinking about learning or deepening your understanding of your native language, right? It's the same thing. So obviously that advanced stage could be a lot longer, but this is typically what I've experienced with the languages I've learned. So the problem with spending too much time in this quadrant is we don't spend nearly as much time in the intermediate and the advanced quadrants, or stages, I should say. And so imagine this, just very basic math. If it takes us 1 year, okay, to go through the basics, and that represents just this amount of our learning journey. So it's going to take us 10 years to get from basic to advanced, all the way to the end of the journey. And if conversely, I guess if we spend a little bit less time on the basics, we could spend more time hopping over or just staying in the intermediate stage or maybe in the advanced stage. So it makes sense to me, just from a time perspective, that we do our best to move from a basic to an intermediate level as quickly as possible, because there really just isn't that much to learn for the basics. And so yeah, I guess that reiterates what I have just talked about, which is, if I would encourage you to think a little bit about how much time you spent in learning Cantonese and where you're at in terms of level, and think about where you want to be at ultimately in terms of your where you want to go with Cantonese. And in the same time covered, would it have been possible to spend a little bit less time in the beginner's quadrant and just move on directly to the intermediate stage? So that's perhaps something to think about if you have time. Mistake number 4, limiting beliefs. And this is something that I guess pertains more to the beginning stages of learning. And this is something I've seen, I guess, online quite a bit as well. And I think Cantonese for learners who are coming from different language families, especially, for example, if your native language or languages are mainly Latin languages or Slavic languages, and you want to, or just from a completely different language family, and you want to learn Cantonese, it's notoriously difficult, or that's the reputation that Cantonese has, right? But you'll see stuff like that, why videos of people talking about why Cantonese is hard, articles where people write about the difficulty of learning Cantonese, and it just really doesn't help us, as learners when learning a language, right? So I'm not going to say that Cantonese isn't hard, but in the same way, every single language, learning any foreign language is hard, right? Because it's something that it forces us to step out of our comfort zones, and it's challenging us to think in a different way, to see the world differently, and to feel differently. So no language is easy per se. And I mean, heck, even English is actually not the easiest language to learn. I mean, I was reading an article recently, and apparently just in the UK alone, $1.2 billion pounds is spent on export earnings in terms of English language teaching. That's 1.2 billion pounds. That's a lot of money to spend on English learning. So, anyway, getting back to my original point, the difficulties that our people usually associate with learning Cantonese, those are usually difficulties that are present at the beginner's level. So those would typically be things like pronunciation, tones, the fact that Cantonese has so many more tones than Mandarin, which of course, as we know, is not true. Mandarin has 4, and then there's a silent tone, and Cantonese has 6 tones, or 9 tones, depending on how you count, right? But in terms of pitch, there's just 6, right? That's the last time I checked. If my math is correct, 6 minus 4 is 2. That's 2 more tones than Mandarin. It's not a huge jump. So those will be some difficulties. Another difficulty that a lot of people generally complain about would be learning characters. It's not easy to learn characters coming from an alphabet-based language. So I guess those are the kind of beliefs that are widespread, but that, or I guess at the same time, a little bit negative, that we should really dispel. We should aim to dispel when learning Cantonese. Okay, moving on. So mistake number 5, the perfectionist mentality. And this isn't as common, and it really just depends on the individual. But I've noticed that some people do tend to be perfectionists when it comes to learning languages. I remember, I think, and this didn't happen to a lot of students I taught in the past, but there were a few where they were very, very particular about their pronunciation. And the ironic thing was those students who were typically very perfectionists with their pronunciation. Those were usually students who were Chinese ethnically, but they didn't grow up, studying in the language, so they're very self-conscious speaking Cantonese again, and they just feel that if I don't get this perfect, I feel very bad for not being able to speak the Cantonese perfectly. And this kind of mentality is crippling because being able to express there we go. Someone said Kenny is super perfectionist. I'm not sure who Kenny is, but yeah, I think you'll probably find people of learning any language who fit into that category. So it's very crippling because at the end of the day, it's about communication, and if people laugh, so be it. It's just a part of the experience. It's if people laugh, it's their fault, okay, for not being patient enough to try and understand what we have to say as foreigners. And so, yeah, the best thing to do is just forget about them and move on. And so there are a couple of things with this perfectionist mentality that I kind of want to go over quickly as well. Well, we just talked about pronunciation. That's one. It's like if I don't pronounce Cantonese perfectly, if I don't hit the tones 100% of the times, people won't understand me well. I mean, it's just not true. More than tones, it's actually the yut ping. If you get that wrong, then it might be a little bit less comprehensible, but it won't hamper communication that much. So relax. Um, it's the other thing might be perfect grammar. If I don't grasp this particular grammar concept perfectly, I'll sound like a foreigner. It'll sound not natural, unnatural to native speakers. And the other thing might be, oh, if I don't have a sufficiently large vocabulary, I won't be able to express myself succinctly. I won't be able to express myself to the same level of precision that I am able to do in my native languages. And I mean, it's just completely uncalled for, in my opinion. So I feel that's a huge mistake. So that's number 5. And of course, if you expect that much about of yourself, then yeah, Cantonese is going to be really hard, and learning any other language is going to be really hard. Because that almost sounds like to me you want to be able to speak Cantonese as well as, if not better than, your native language. Well, it's just a matter. Again, it's just a matter of numbers. How many years have you spent in your life, probably your whole life, right, learning your native language and honing it, making it better? And that's in an academic, a formal environment. And how many years have you spent learning Cantonese in comparison? It doesn't make sense. The math does not add up. So, perfectionist mentality, hugely crippling, not useful. Okay, moving on. Mistake number 6. This is an interesting one because I feel that with this, I don't think this is unique to Cantonese, but it's definitely a lot harder in Cantonese. No realistic scenarios to expose yourself to in Cantonese. So what I mean by that is typically at the beginner's level, you'll be using things like conversational dialogues. I mean, teach yourself. The series is basically a collection of conversational dialogues lessons. However, the fact of the matter is that conversational dialogues and basically everything that you see in beginners materials, or even to a certain extent intermediate materials, they're not realistic in the sense that you're not going to be able to use that stuff in real life, like in that particular scenario. I remember when I was learning French, I think this have been more than a decade ago when I picked up this book. This was Ultimate French Advanced. It's still one of the best French conversational dialogues books at a more advanced level that I've ever seen. And I remember that in lesson 1, it was a passenger who was on a plane, and he was just randomly striking a conversation with the passenger next to him, right? And as I read through it, the conversation was really good. It was really French, and I learned a lot of new words I would have never learned. And I still remember it today, like a decade a little bit more later. But again, the fact of the matter is that these are almost like completely random conversations that you will, or scenarios that you'll never run into. I mean, think about it. Like, when's the last time you randomly just talked to the passengers like sitting next to you on the plane? Probably like never, right? It's just kind of weird to do that. Anyway, more maybe for some people it might be a normal thing. But the fact of the matter, it doesn't change that these are not typical scenarios. They don't represent the things that we actually need in real life. So, well, there we go. That I think resembles what we do in planes, right? We sleep, or maybe we watch like a couple of crappy movies that are playing. So, excuse me. So a lot of these learning materials, and not just for Cantonese, I feel like instead of having phrases presented naturally, it's more like scenarios are artificially created in order to introduce a set of vocabulary or phrases instead of the other way around, right? It's like you have a scenario and naturally there's some phrases that come up and then you introduce it. That's the way it should be, right? But no, these are artificially induced scenarios. So yeah, I kind of have a problem with that. And mistake number 7, finally, lack of breadth. This is a huge one. I think this ties in a little bit with what I talked about earlier. We often, I think, go back and if we think about the kind of topics that we have studied Cantonese in, or that we have heard or seen material in Cantonese, the range and the breadth of the topics are generally fairly limited, right? And they really are, at most, they're at like an A2, B1-ish kind of a level. And while those things are still useful to a certain extent, the topics that really matter to us, that we want to be able to express in our lives, do you ever really see in language learning resources? So I guess that would be, I feel, some of the more common mistakes that I've seen among people who are learning Cantonese. All right, so we're now at kind of like the halfway point. We're at 26 past. I'm going to pause here for 5 minutes, and yeah, just we could take a quick break and come back, and I'll kind of like reveal the biggest mistake I think of all. Yes, there's actually a secret quote unquote bonus 8th one. I didn't next on the next slide. So anyway, let's come back at 31 past. I'll see you guys soon. All right, it's now 31 past, and I think we're just going to continue. Can everyone still hear me? Any yeses? Okay, I see 2 yeses. Oh, okay, awesome. Thanks, guys. All right, so we just a quick recap in the first session. I'll share it with you guys based on like doing Canto Lounge, and awesome. Oh, thanks. I based on my experience with Canto Lounge, creating materials, and teaching Cantonese as well as other languages in the past. Some mistakes I feel are common, especially to beginners. So hopefully, my objective of doing that is to show you guys some of the difficulties of common mistakes or difficulties that people encounter, and that you won't make them again. I'll talk about what I think are good solutions to these problems later on. Before we do that, let's wrap that up with what I feel to be the biggest mistake of all. Mistake number 8, consistency. And I know it sounds cliche, I know it sounds cheesy, but the fact of the matter is that consistency, I feel, is already hard enough just because we have so much stuff to deal with in life. It's so easy to just get lost in all of the crazy stuff that happens in life. But more importantly, the question I want to that we want to ask is, why is it hard to be consistent, especially in Cantonese? Well, the fact of the matter is that I feel that I've said this a few times before in various places. For example, I think in the big, the complete guide to learn Cantonese, and as well in various places. To me, the hardest part of learning Cantonese is not actually learning the language itself. It's the lack of having appropriate learning resources, especially in the intermediate stages. And I think that if you guys have learned Cantonese for a while, you'll come to agree that it's super hard to actually find something after the beginner stages. You're almost forced to either go like the native materials route, which is really, really hard, because characters is actually, it is quite a huge barrier, especially in the beginning, right? Maybe if you're Japanese or you know Japanese, you might have a bit of an advantage there, but it's still not that easy, right? And Cantonese is a spoken language. It's not a written language. So, okay, so we've discussed some problems or mistakes that people encounter when learning Cantonese. What can we do about them? Let's go through the list once again. No curriculum after beginner's level. Well, I guess the solution then would be to introduce a curriculum via bite-sized materials. And it really doesn't matter what it is. It could be an article, a drama clip, or it could even be like brochures you pick up if you happen to live in Hong Kong, or just stuff you see on like Hong Kong websites and all that kind of good stuff. As long as it's something that's relevant, and hopefully, and this is the important thing, right? Hopefully something that's interesting to you, right? Because if it's interesting, you'll be motivated to go through it. And second of all, it'll stick, which is really important. So bite-sized material there. I'm going to talk about my top 3 materials later on that I recommend. But yeah. Okay, moving on. Solution number 2 to this problem, lacking in depth or volume. So what can we do about that? I guess, for example, if you're learning Cantonese via lessons, if you're doing like a lesson a week, and your lessons, you feel like you're kind of talking repeatedly about the same topics over and over again. Or maybe you're working with Glossica, you're doing like 10 to 20 sentences a day, which is actually quite admirable. I don't think I have it in me if I to do Glossica at that velocity or that degree of consistency. I know someone who has, so kudos to them, or to you guys if you're doing that. Would it be possible to kind of like reflect at this point and to perhaps add to that great momentum that you've gained during this period of time? And it doesn't have to be like something drastic like doubling it, right? It could just be doing something a little bit different, change something small about it. For example, in a lesson, you might want to come before the lesson prepared and say to your teacher, like, in this lesson, I want to talk about X topic because X topic is relevant to me. I'm interested in learning more about how Cantonese is, like how to talk about this topic in Cantonese, and that's a small change. And so you kind of like prevent yourself from repeating yourself over and over again. Or maybe if you're doing Glossica, you might want to perhaps add a sentence or two every day, just a way of adding volume. There's always more to learn in language and with languages, and never enough time. So anyway, moving on. Number 3. It's taking too long to beginner's materials. So I guess the obvious kind of advice thing to do here is to move to native materials ASAP. And I guess in the beginning, it's going to feel, it's going to feel like a giant leap to go from like beginner materials I talk about, I don't know, shopping and daily life, and then suddenly you're I don't know, reading the news, and then there's like politics, talking about the economy, the housing market, and society issues. That does feel like a leap, right? But it's perfectly fine because, and this is really important, it feels like a leap, but only in the beginning. And I can almost guarantee that if you stick to it, what you're doing long enough, at the very least for, I think, somewhere around like the 6 month period, it will start to feel a lot less foreign. It doesn't feel like something that's completely incomprehensible. And yes, it does get better over time. So the only thing that's stopping you from getting to that level is the decision to actually move on from beginner's materials and just say, I'm done with this. I'm just going to move on, and I'm going to dive into and see, how native speakers, what kind of things they look at and they read on a daily basis. And this will happen more quickly than you think. So I would really encourage you, if you're still at a beginner's level and you feel that you've been with beginner's materials for a period of time, I would highly encourage you to at least try, and have a look at what's out there. I mean, what's the worst that can happen, right? Okay, moving on. Number 4, limiting beliefs. And I think that this is something that that comes from precision. That comes from the specifics, excuse me, because it really depends on what kind of limiting beliefs that you have and what you feel are difficult. And if you know precisely what you feel difficult, and again, all of these beliefs, they usually pertain to the beginner stages. So if you're still there, this is the time, I guess, to pinpoint what you really find difficult. Like, for example, let's just say that you find listening to Cantonese hard. You find understanding Cantonese clips difficult. So what can you do about it? Well, listening is still a little bit vague. You want to drill down more deeply and ask yourself, like, is it because am I not understanding Cantonese properly because of a lack of vocabulary, or am I not understanding because my listening skills, in terms of my ability to convert what I hear in Cantonese to yutping or characters, am I lacking in that area? So drilling down more deeply will tell you exactly where you need to put a little bit more effort in learning. Or maybe you're struggling with pronunciation. And so at this point, you might want to ask yourself, is it tones that you're struggling with? Because having a tonal language it could be disconcerting to certain people who come from non-tonal languages, right? European languages, or maybe like a Slavic language, or pretty much any, I think tonal languages, there are a lot of Asian languages that are tonal. Or is it maybe yutping that you find difficult? There's certain sounds that you find, like the OE and the EOs, that you find literally impossible to pronounce. Or maybe does it just feel foreign when you pronounce it and it just feels somewhat uncomfortable? And if you know exactly what is challenging to you, then you can work on that, maybe with a teacher, or maybe you can just find drills or design drills yourself to focus on that for a period of time until you overcome that obstacle. And moving on, number 5, the perfectionist mentality. I think that I'm actually a huge believer in having positive first experiences when learning a language. And in Cantonese, I feel that your first experiences, because I feel that your first experiences with the language that you're learning, they will leave a deep impression. So, and the reason I'm mentioning that is because the perfectionist mentality is something that comes across most clearly when you're interacting with other people, be it your Cantonese teacher or maybe Cantonese friends that you have. And when you're speaking Cantonese with them, that's when the perfectionist mentality will come up, or maybe not, depending on how they react, right? And so I would advise you to choose your Cantonese teachers and friends carefully, because, like, I think when I was scrolling through the messages earlier, I think people were like saying, I think someone said that their Cantonese friends were being like unusually harsh on their pronunciation, and I think that can leave a scar, right? Especially when you're already learning, trying to speak and express yourself in a foreign language, and you really can use with a little bit of leeway, a little bit of patience and understanding. So I would encourage you, like, I know it sounds cheesy, but it's really important to find someone who has that patience and who's not going to laugh at you, because it is an unnerving experience. So, and I guess if you're with someone who's a little bit negative, that's when your perfectionist mentality will worsen, right? Because, oh, I had this friend and he's always like criticizing how I speak in Cantonese. And so moving forward, it's just not going to leave a very positive, a lot of positivity in you with Cantonese. And that might actually demotivate you moving forward learning it. So, yeah, I think that's, yeah, there you go. I see Yin Xiao, and yeah, it's something that I feel very strongly about. So do not underestimate the strength of friendships and the people who are you're surrounding with when learning a new language. Okay, moving on. Number 6, no realistic scenarios to kind of expose yourself to in Cantonese. I think this ties in with using native materials, because whenever you're using native materials, those are immediately applicable. That's what's happening now. It's contemporary. You will find these conversations, these cropping up in conversations among people who speak Cantonese in Hong Kong and Macau and overseas Cantonese communities in Guangzhou, Guangdong. And so I would, for myself, I've always liked recommending like good daily, like family themed drama series, like TVB drama series to learn from, because those are really useful in terms of the kinds of things that you'll learn from them. They're going to be very applicable to your ordinary like day-to-day life. So that's a good starting point. And yeah, there we go. So I think that it, to a certain extent, there are like different trains of thoughts regarding this. Like some teachers really prefer to point out mistakes like right when you speak, but there are some teachers who kind of like jot down notes when you're making mistakes and then discuss them over with you like at the end of a lesson. I prefer the latter, and that's how I used to work with my students. And that's how I used to work when I was a student, maybe learning Korean, Japanese, and other languages. It's just so disconcerting when you're speaking in a foreign language and someone interrupts you and say, "Oh, you're wrong." It's not a very encouraging experience. So yeah, yeah, there you go. And some people actually prefer it, so it really just depends. Moving on. So getting back to the topic, what you learn, it should be current, right? And if it's not current, and most importantly, if it's not relevant to your life, it's like you'll build up passive vocabulary, but it's a little bit discouraging to not be able to use something that you have learned, right? Okay, moving on. Number 7, lack of breadth. And the topics that you usually learn about in Cantonese, they're just not that, especially with beginners materials, they're just not that broad. Again, it's just the same old topics over and over again. And I believe that these are the types of things that people talk about for the most part. And don't get me wrong, right? Because how do I know this? That's usually what I talked about with most of my students in the past with Cantonese and when I was doing other languages. And while this is good for like a nice breaker kind of a conversation, if you ever want to have a deeper conversation with someone, that's not going to cut it, right? Because you want to be able to talk about your feelings, talk about what you think about what's happening in society, maybe what's happening in your home country with a friend. And it's like, oh, for example, in Korea, we also have, or maybe in Japan, young people are also, I'm sorry, I kind of use Japan and Korea a lot because these are kind of like my favorite languages. So anyways, but yeah, you might want to talk about Cantonese. You might want to talk about your with your friends in Cantonese. Like, oh, it's also we have unemployment. We also have like housing prices that are kind of like harder, but maybe not as hard as in Hong Kong to deal with. And yeah, so if you want to talk about stuff like that a little bit deeper, go a little deeper. These topics that you are exposed to in these typical materials, Yes, there we go. Someone wrote, yeah, it's been a really really great language experience learning Korean. So uh, let's see, moving on. Yeah, so I would encourage you to think about what topics that are relevant, that are important to you, and maybe put in a little bit of work there. Maybe expose yourself to materials in those topic areas. Maybe you want to talk to teachers or your Cantonese friends about them and ask for feedback in terms of how you can improve. We can definitely expand this, right? And finally, lack of consistency. Um, this is always something that I've struggled with as well, because there's just, for example, if you're a full-time job, there's sometimes after you clock out, it's not like as if you can just like forget about everything and just like relax and go about your evening. There's still work, residual work that you sometimes are worried about, and sometimes you have to work overtime, and all of that just cuts down in terms of your ability to continue on with your learning, right? So I guess the important thing here is to be able to ask yourself and answer very honestly, what can you do comfortably every day? It doesn't matter how little or how insignificant it seems. Doing something every day is better than doing nothing. And if you have been learning Cantonese for a while and you stopped for a period of time, you know that after you get back to it, it's like, oh my goodness, I wish I didn't stop. Because stopping, unless you already have a lot of experience in it, it really uh, makes your level like slide, and that's something that we want to avoid. So I would suggest starting with like a baseline 30-day challenge, doing something that you can do. Like it could be just revising stuff that you've looking over stuff you've learned in the past, or it could be, I don't know, maybe doing one more conversation session for Cantonese in a week. And once you've done 30 days, and it doesn't have to be like every single day for 30 days, right? Or you can kind of like do, I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 sessions every week, or maybe 3 or 4 sessions, whatever you are comfortable with doing and whatever makes sense to you. So, it just really depends. This isn't like a hard figure. This isn't like absolute advice. So, and then you want to extend that to 90 days or maybe to 160 days, maybe to 360 days if you can. But whatever, it really just depends on what you want. My recommended time frame is to go for 90 days or 3 months if you can. Any more than that is if you really want to drill down on something. If you're at an intermediate stage, for example, you might want to read the paper 3 times, 4 times a week, an article every day. And if you do that, if you can stick with doing that for a year, you'll see amazing improvements in your ability to understand what's happening in society in Hong Kong, for example, or maybe you're reading the paper, Chinese paper in your native country, if that's available. So, yeah, so some example challenges include might be one news article every day, maybe like 45-minute sessions that are highly focused around a topic every week. Maybe you want to record yourself, even talk about a different topic like 2-3 times a week. It doesn't have to be long. It can be just like 5-10 minutes of ranting about whatever that interests you in Cantonese. I do that, right? Like I do that in the showers and in French or whatever, and it's good. And sometimes I know that I make mistakes, but it keeps the language alive, and there's an occasion to use it in a somewhat consistent manner. So, and I guess this is kind of preferable to changing all the time because, consistency, volume, and concentration, all of these things, you guys probably know this already, these really breeds results over time. So I would encourage you guys to really not underestimate the value of that. And I guess, yeah, just make the best judgment based on your preferences, availability of your schedule and learning style, because for everyone, it's obviously going to be different. But once again, I would encourage you guys to try at least doing one 90-day challenge and see how that goes. Start with 30 days. I feel that is accessible to everyone, and then see how well you do at like the 30-day marker. Reflect upon your experiences and your learnings, and then try and extend that to 90 days. Okay, so learning resources. I think this is really, really cool. And I think every single time I talk about resources, I almost like talk about the same resources over and over again. And the reason I do that is just because I feel like these are so good for learning that, I mean, even, and they're current, they're contemporary. So it's just something that they're readily available. It's not something that you can only find in Hong Kong or something like that. So I'm sticking with the stuff that works. Number one is a site called HK01. This is one of my favorite news sites in Cantonese, and I usually I read this almost every day. It's just, it gives you I feel like the articles written in HK01, they're very well written, they're very well presented, and they're not too long. And if you have a look over, this is the homepage, right? On the very top at the bar, there's like a 更多, like with a little downward arrow pointing. There's so many categories and topics you can explore. And there's like philosophical topics. There's like stuff about education, stuff about health, some about fitness. Whatever your interests are, you'll find something in here that matches your interests. So you can pick something and read it, and that's going to be your practice for 2-3 articles per week. I feel that's doable at an intermediate stage. So hk01.com. Highly encourage you guys to look at that. Okay, moving on. Next is the TV series, the home like theme drama Oi Weiga. This is like I kid you not, this is a mega series. This has been like the longest series ever produced by TVB. I think at this point there have been over 2,200 episodes of this produced. They're 30 minutes long per episode. I mean, yeah, oh my god, it's really good, right? And I used to watch something similar with Korean as well, but anyway. So there's definitely, you'll never run out of materials. It's highly, highly colloquial, and you'll find so many useful expressions from there. Everything is subtitled, not in Cantonese and Chinese, but that's better than nothing, right? And you'll still learn a lot of vocabulary. So I highly encourage you guys to watch it. And it's like very relaxing. So you don't really feel pressure, I feel like, when watching it. And if you ever get tired, you can always just like watch it for entertainment purposes. Okay, so that's number 2. And you'll find like clips of this on YouTube. And okay, so I see a question. Do you think it's a good show for a near beginner? I think that it's not something that you want to. I don't recommend watching TV series for complete beginners for learning purposes, but you can certainly maybe watch and try and just enjoy it. You don't have to think about it as learning. And when you get to the level where you can start following it, then that's when you can revisit the series. But treat it as a learning material instead of an entertainment source or a place to help you assimilate with Cantonese, if that makes sense. Yep. Yeah, no worries. And so, yeah, you could search the series up on YouTube. There are like very short clips of like 2-3 minutes of preview, so you could start there if you want. Okay, moving on. Series number 3. Yes, from Burba said, if you can watch with a mentor or a teacher and have them guide you through it, that can be very, very helpful. Like to focus in, hone in on phrases that could be useful to kind of like point out, and this phrase is useful to learn. The third series I recommend is Hung Chang Da. Hung Chang Da is like a series that's been running since, I don't know, like the 1970s. It's won numerous awards. And it's basically a documentary series that touches on some of the most current like topics in Hong Kong. It ranges from just, it covers any and everything you can think of, like food safety, social media. I think there was like an episode on sex education recently, and some interesting ones are like interesting spots in Hong Kong or umbrella revolution and some political topics if that's relevant. So highly recommend it, especially at a more upper intermediate to advanced level if you're looking for materials of that nature. So it's really a good opportunity to kind of like understand what's happening in Hong Kong if you're interested in learning more as well. So that's it in terms of kind of like the main bulk of the presentation. But what if I tell you that there's a resource that can solve all of these problems that we talked about in this presentation. If there is something that, for example, that has some sort of a curriculum that's to follow. Canton Lounge doesn't actually do that yet, but hopefully there might be something. I'll do something about that soon. Number two, that has materials that contain depth and that has volume. And number three, that serves materials that are at an intermediate and advanced level, and that's entirely in Cantonese, right? That's what I think you guys and some of the readers have been asking for. Number four, that kind of breaks limiting beliefs by presenting Cantonese in a way that's that's easily digestible and where the scope of it is limited and you're not going to be overwhelmed. And number five, focuses on the important parts, right? Instead of having, I don't know, like being very sporadic in terms of what these materials present. And number six, presents realistic everyday topics that you can actually use, like they will actually run into, and things that you'll actually talk about. Number seven, it actually has a spectrum of topics woven in. And yeah, most importantly, it delivers new stuff consistently, so you don't have to like go around hunting for materials ever again. Does that sound interesting to you guys? Would that anyone be interested in that? Right. So I guess hopefully this presentation has been useful in kind of like helping us go back and think about reflecting some of the mistakes that are common to learners. And this is kind of what I'm planning to do. I would love to launch a product that resolves all of these problems and that tackles materials at an intermediate level that based on what I've done with authentic Cantonese transcripts and what I've learned from Canton drills, it's somewhat similar to that, but there's going to be changes, and it's going to be a slightly, maybe one tier easier than that, but we'll see how that goes in terms of difficulty and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I see people are interested, so that's yeah, something that I will look to do. And so yeah, I'm giving it the name Project Kaneko. It almost sounds Japanese, Kaneko, but anyway. I will talk more, I'll let you guys know more about this project over time in the upcoming weeks. And yeah, so thank you so much for sticking around in this presentation. I hope that this has been helpful and kind of like serving as a reflection session in terms of our progress in learning Cantonese. And yeah, so yeah, you're very welcome. Not at all, burba burba. And let's see, questions time. Do you guys have any questions that you want to ask? Realize we're running a little bit over time, but yeah. The characters for the third show, great, yes, awesome. I will type that in there. Yeah, the font really doesn't help. It's Hung Teng Da. The first two, Hung Teng, yep. Yep. Yeah, Hung Teng is not excuse me, a very common word, so yeah. Great, so that's that. Should I type the other shows on here as well? I guess I'll just do that. Oi Wika. And the other one would be just like Hong Kong. Yeah, that's that. Any other questions that I think I've answered most of them? Scrolling back. Great. I think that's about it then. All right. Thank you so much, you guys. Once again, I really appreciate you joining. And yeah, so just please look out for our emails in the upcoming weeks, and I'll talk a little bit more about this new kind of segment that will be coming. Yeah, I'll say something. I see TY Kenny. I'm not sure what that means, but yeah, no worries. No worries. Thank you so much for tuning in. All right, I'm going to close the webinar now. I'll see you guys. Talk to you guys next time. Thank you so much once again. Bye bye. 多謝晒大家。